Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 1 o'clock at the PCGamesN Theatre here at W.A.S.D, day 2. Today we're talking about trends in game development, nostalgia specifically. The premise of the talk being, I guess, that we've seen in recent years a preponderance of games that look increasingly to gaming's own past, to the 80s, the 90s, in terms of reviving IPs and in recreating looks and feels with demakes, build engine games, all that sort of good stuff. And we've got a very qualified panel to talk about what's going on here, and I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. So to my left, please.
Hi, I'm Ashley Day. I am the head of developer relations at Team 17. I think probably more pertinently to that, if you go back many moons ago, I ran the retro section in GamesTM magazine, and still write for Retro Gamer today. So, yeah, I am very nostalgic.
Good stuff. Gary?
I'm Gary Carr. I am nostalgic because I'm that old. I started in 1985, Palace Software. My first game, I was co-designer and artist animator on was Barbarian. I did 4 years at Palace Software, then joined this young upstart called Peter Molyneux as a sixth member of Bullfrog in an attic above a hi-fi shop, making games like Populous Powermonger. Eventually worked on the theme games, obviously, and then went on to co-found a studio called Monkey Foot. We released a lot of games, I think, in a slightly nostalgic way, harking back to our Bullfrog days, and we made things like Startopia, Urban Chaos. And then I joined Lionhead as one of the studio heads there, looking after one of the teams, not the Fable team. I was not fortunate enough to run that team. And then I left Lionhead and co-founded 2 Point Studios with Mark Webley and Ben Hymes.
Very cool. And joining us via Zoom, because he's laid low with COVID right now, so we're very grateful for him turning up, Charles Cecil. Tell us a little about yourself.
Hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Fantastic, great. Well, I can hear a little echo. Oh dear. So I'm going to pretend that I can't hear that. Great. Well, yes. Well, I'm very nostalgic as well. So we're all very nostalgic. I actually have been privileged enough to be writing games since 1981 for the Sinclair ZX81, and that was for a company called Arctic Computing, and we had 1 K of memory in our ZX81s, which was fantastic. And then founded in 1990. Our best known franchises are Beyond the Steel Sky and Broken Sword, both of which have many iterations. And I guess I can talk about nostalgia from that perspective.
Very cool. So I thought we'd start, I guess, by establishing a bit of a frame of reference, and this was an idea that I got from your talking point before the panel, actually. So let's talk about some games that we've seen coming out in recent years that have sort of got nostalgia right and are treating their IPs well and coming up with good, relevant new iterations of this kind of thing.
All right. Well, I guess since I suggested this one, I'll go first. And I'm a big Sega fan. So I'm going to talk about some Sega games. I think Sega have got a really interesting model at the moment when it comes to their legacy IP. Obviously, Sega are a very big business with lots of going interests appealing to large commercial audiences, and don't necessarily have the time to invest in unearthing an old beloved IP, and they don't necessarily have the exact right people. Correct me if I'm wrong. So people move on, right? So the original creators of Sonic the Hedgehog, they're no longer at Sega, but there are plenty of fans out there who now know how to make video games, and the model that Sega have of licensing out their properties to great publishers and great developers around the world, I think is, at the time they started doing that was quite unique for a AAA publisher to do that. Quite brave, I think.
You're talking specifically about Sonic Mania and Streets of Rage 4, right?
Yeah, so I think they're tremendous examples. They're not the only examples, but I think Sonic Mania gets that brilliantly right. You know, they worked with fan developers in the community who were essentially making mods and level hacks of existing Sonic games, taking the assets from the original games and then making new creations with them. And I think Sega were very smart to harness that and say, hey, let's make a commercial product out of that.
Yeah.
And the results speak for themselves. In my opinion, one of the best Sonic games since the 90s.
Yeah, very cool. And you guys, Charles and Gary, you're obviously working on the 2-Point Hospital and Beyond a Steel Sky. So there's been you both been taking a look at your own IPs. Are there any other examples you'd care to name in addition to what Ashley said?
Charles, would you like to go first?
Yes, well, thank you. From an adventure perspective, when I was thinking about this, it's a really interesting subject. And I think the key question is who are you doing it for? What is your audience? Is it you? Is it the original audience? Is it a new audience? And I think what's vital is to say then, what was it about the original that the audience that you're identifying really liked first time round, and how can I retain it? And then how can I enhance it so that it's the same as the original, but better? And I'm going to use the example, I think, of Thimbleweed Park, which I was very skeptical about to begin with. But I think it's actually a great example because it's aimed at people who love point and click. And it very much emulated the low-res 64 color, but added visual effects that were absolutely cheating these constraints and would have been impossible at the time to create a really, really interesting hybrid. I think on the other side, I'm going to criticize the first upresing of Monkey Island, which completely changed the graphic style. I mean, why they did that, I have no idea. But it meant that it was a completely different offering and missed the mark by quite some way. So yeah, no, I'm going to hold. Obviously, I'd love to hold my own games up, but I think it's probably better to hold Thimbleweed Park as something that went out, was clear on what it wanted to achieve, and absolutely did achieve it.
I mean, for me, nostalgia isn't something I aim to do deliberately. I think starting 2-Point Studios was partly inspired by the guys who did Prison Architects, that people that stripped something right the way back to just gameplay. That meant that it was possible for teams to come back and build games without needing teams of 200 people, which is what I'd become used to. I'd become used to Lionhead having 300-400 people perhaps in the studio and maybe 200 or 300 on one project and maybe 100 people on a project that's going into development. And that sort of gives people little opportunity to have a voice and to contribute. So when I started to see a lot of self-funded or crowd-funded studios popping up, using a lot of good middleware, which is available now, which didn't used to be, everything was proprietary, made me excited again about making games. Because I think for me, and I said earlier on in an earlier panel, when it became a bit like, you were the widget guy on a project, or you were the manager of the people who were making the widgets, it becomes less interesting as an industry. So to me, there's a difference between nostalgia, or people making games look old, and people wanting to go back to old ways of making games. So they're two quite distinct things for me.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, my next question was going to sort of try and pick at the factors that might be driving this trend. And, you touched on one of them that I sort of had anticipated being mentioned, which is, the availability of good middleware and the fact that, so many people who, I mean, as you say, who were consumers and fans of these IPs back in the day are now able to make games without getting into the industry in any sense. Is there anything else that you guys would like to pick out in terms of, what's going on here and what's driving it?
I think people are just getting older, right? Everyone's getting older every second of the day, and nostalgia is a natural, normal part of everyday life. Not just for consumer products and entertainment, but you can be you can be nostalgic for the village you grew up in, or a relative that's no longer with us. So catering to that human need, I think, is not only perfectly normal, it makes good business sense, right? But I think this is probably getting into something we might touch on later in the talk, but identifying what is the wave of nostalgia that is right for now or right for 3 years from now. That's the tricky thing, because we're now getting into different generations of gamers. The things I'm nostalgic for as a 40-year-old are not the same things that a 25-year-old will be nostalgic for. So I think nostalgia in games, it's very quickly not becoming about 2D pixel art. Yeah. I think it's about recapturing things that people love.
Yeah, that's fair. That makes sense. Charles?
Do you not think that it's actually both? Do you not think it's both? Because a lot of people who talk about old games, they do certainly look back with rose-tinted glasses. But one of the key things, of course, is that with the constraints that we had back in those days, games were in many ways much more focused. And that focus came about because we simply weren't able. We didn't have the color palette. We didn't have, the reason, of course, that games were pixelated back then was because we could only create them in a certain resolution. We only had on the Amiga 64 colors, on the SD 32 colors, and it defined the style and it defined what we did. And I mentioned that we started writing games on the ZX81, which had 1K of memory. We wrote a chess program in 1K because that was all we had. So I think it's coming from two sides. I think one is you look at those early games, the Space Invaders, the Galactians, they're super focused. They know what they want to achieve, and that is all they want to achieve. And as Gary said, there's something wonderful about being able to make a simple game like that, which is super focused. But then on the other, of course, you bring through the emotional side, which is memories of the time, but also, particularly in terms of adventures, the memories that they have of playing with other people, which comes back again and again and again. So actually, I think nostalgia works on many, many levels.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the things I remember as an artist, initially I was sort of a designer or artist when I started. I've done all sorts of jobs as you do as you get older, but when I was back as a working artist on games, my job was to hide pixels, not celebrate them. It was and try and make colours that weren't in the palette. So strangely, when I see nostalgic games, I kind of have a bit of a wry smile about the fact that they celebrate the pixel. And it's really gaudy in there, and it's like jaggedy edges, and that back when I started would have been frowned upon. You were trying to smooth the edges off, create colours that didn't exist. Out of the palette. So I do like it, but I'm of an age that I kind of do have a little bit of a wry smile about seeing it. But I still love it, because I think there's something beautiful about a pixel. And one of the things with, and I don't want to bring this on to things I do, because I hate that sort of self-promotion, but when we started to think about the art style for campus and before that hospital, it was, how can we think of something that might look sort of okay in 20 years from now? Because things like Theme Hospital has still been played on good old games. And no one's calling out how it looks particularly, because it looked hand-drawn, and therefore it's kind of devoid of being critiqued in the same way something that's technology-driven is. So I remember at the time when we were doing Theme Hospital, the studio, Peter was doing Dungeon Keeper. And I remember thinking, oh, my game looks terrible. Peter's game looks amazing, because it's all look, it's got 40 polygons. Oh, wow, it looks amazing. And of course, if you look back at it now, it doesn't quite stand up, because the technology is the thing that's moved on. And it kind of overshadows the artist's endeavors, really. So we tried to think of a style that actually isn't tech-driven, but so we've got this kind of claymation feel, just to try and make it naive enough that it won't necessarily be critiqued for how it would look in, say, 20 years' time. It may not work out that way, but that was the hope anyway.
That's really, I mean, I was, we had Daniel Mullins, who made Inscription, on the panel yesterday, and I bring it up because, not to spoil anything, if you haven't played it, apologies, but there's a segment of Inscription which harks back very deliberately to, very obvious sort of pixel art styles, and I found it quite, it's very deliberately set against the other part of Inscription, which is, again, very pixel heavy, but it's as you said, there's modern technology in there, including modern lighting and things, which makes it all feel a lot more sort of smooth and natural and timeless, I suppose. And like the contrast there was quite jarring. But yeah, it's just an observation, really. The reason I take an interest in this, I've been playing PC games since the early 90s, and I have a certain amount of nostalgia for things like Commander Keen and Wolfenstein 3D, which are the ones that I grew up on, and the early Bullfrog and Lionhead games, of course. But I worry a little about the dark side of nostalgia and about the sort of preponderance of it. And I want to touch on that a little bit. Like, I see this particularly in pop culture, where everything that comes out of Hollywood these days is a prequel or a sequel or a reboot of an IP. And I worry about like a little bit of a stifling of creativity, I suppose. And like, not that we're out of ideas. There's loads of great stuff that comes out of games. But are you guys worried about that at all?
I've just looked across the hall at some of those indie games.
Yeah.
There's nothing reproduced out there. They're showing us how not to get complacent about doing sequels and things with just another number on the end. I remember when I started, when we first did a sequel, I thought we were copping out because I thought we should be coming up with something new. But there's so much money. When you've got an IP, it's so difficult to, and let's say you've had some success with that IP, it's so difficult to park it. It just is, because there is a lot of effort that goes into establishing that spotlight on that game. And if you build an audience, if you back away from that, that's a big risky thing to do. So it is difficult, but I think over the corridor there, those games are the ones that are going to be, chomping at the bit to take your space. So I hope they continue to keep doing the amazing stuff. And it's great to see, actually, that's the busy hall. That's where most of the people are having fun right now. So I think that will stop us getting complacent. But I think it's just a problem with bigger games. And there's only so many big games you can have a year. So it's difficult not to become, if you like, churning out something that has the same...
Yeah, it's all about risk aversion, isn't it? Is that the only reason, or...?
I don't know. I mean, Charles may have a different view, but for me, I just... It's so difficult to have a game where people, I've done games which I think are better than some of my recent games, if you like, and they just haven't, for whatever reason, resonated. So it is difficult to sort of park success, if you like.
Yeah.
But I think I think we should be brave, and we should always try not to just regurgitate something we've already done if we can, afford to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts, Charles, Ashley?
Well, all I'd say is that if we're writing narrative games, then a sequel is the next chapter. Yeah, so I think that's probably easier to justify. So I would say that there's nothing wrong with that. Just to throw one more thing in, if I may. Obviously, in when it comes to narrative, in games you have to create a reason to want to play the game. And in film, you have a lot more time to set that up. In a game, you have to do it almost immediately. And once you've built that empathetic character, it is a shortcut. And then players who will play the sequel can immediately come in without having to spend the time to learn the character in a way that is harder than in a film. So, I mean, maybe I'm just sort of trying to justify it. But I think as long as you don't flog the dead horse, I see no reason having new chapters.
Yeah, cool. So to talk a little bit about, how deliberate, I suppose, is this trend towards, I mean, a certain amount of this will, of course, emerge organically for the reasons that we talked about, like gamers who are sort of nostalgic for their childhoods are able to sort of create games that sort of celebrate that and explore that. But from a publisher perspective, perhaps, Ashley, Team 17 obviously had some classic IPs, Worms being the standout example. Is this a trend that you guys are very deliberate about pursuing, or is it just coming from a sort of a more bottom-up perspective, like this is something that we've observed, we can lean into it?
Team 17 is an interesting one when you look at this topic, because you could look at Team 17 as the Worms company. We've made a hell of a lot of Worms games, but we've also published a hell of a lot of original IPs.
Yeah.
Indie games, I think, are defined by originality. And let me tell you, it is very, 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 very difficult to sell a new IP. whether you're an indie or a AAA, that is a huge challenge because there just isn't the initial hook for an audience to identify with something and go, yes, I know this is for me. Instantly, in the best way is for them to play it for themselves. And in the internet world, that's not always the first touch point someone will have with a game. At the same time, I completely see that of course there's a demand for sequels, and within those, it is not impossible to come up with new ideas. I think often with a first game, I certainly observe designers are leaving ideas on the table because you have to get the game out on time, you have to get it out within a certain budget. So there are umpteen ideas that do not make it into that first game, and maybe not even into the second game. So creative people are creative, and those great ideas will come along. I'm conscious I might be drifting very, very far from your actual question.
No, not at all.
I think Team 17 will definitely do more Worms games in the future because when you've got an idea that people like, they do want more of it.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of leads me on to consider whether maybe there's something about games that makes them less susceptible to the risks of sort of over-dependence on nostalgia or on existing IPs that I just bemoaned from, in the form of like TV and film. If you make a film like the sort of Terminator or something, Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, brilliant. Less impressed by all of the sequels and all the reboots that Hollywood keeps trying to turn out, just to take as an example. Like, they existed as these perfect single things, and it's quite clear that it's commercial rather than creative imperatives, at least in my theory, that's led to all of the sequels and prequels of all of the big IPs in Hollywood. Is, for the reasons you talked about, and perhaps for other reasons that you guys might like to share, do you think there's less of a risk of that in games? Is there more potential for games to sort of reinvent or extend or meaningfully contribute to their own previous iterations?
Charles, would you like to go first?
Oh, you're very generous. Thank you. Well, I would say that the big difference is that in games, of course, our technology keeps moving forward, and that allows us to do things that weren't possible before. Whereas film, technology does move forward in a way, but it's apart from visual effects, that there aren't substantial differences to 20, 30 years ago. And so, Gary was describing, Ashley was describing the Sega games and the opportunities that came from the new technology and the new tools. And so I think we probably can justify more doing reinventions because there are things that we can make that are significantly different and enhanced, provided, as I said at the beginning, we understand, one, who the audience is, and two, what actually was the attraction in the first place. The big pitfall that so many people fall into is to move from 2D to 3D because they can. And in doing so, actually lose the essence of what was so wonderful first time round. But yeah, I would say that, you look at, the Ghostbusters and all the Charlie's Angels, all of these films that were perfectly good 20, 30 years ago. And they've, of course, attempted to reinvent them for a new audience, but they've fallen flat because in many cases they were no better than what they replaced.
I think from a commercial perspective as well, when you look at what's going on in Hollywood, there is a huge revival of brands that were big in the 80s or the 90s, and I think one of the reasons that works is because people have children.
Yeah.
Right. So if you create something that is suitable for children, but also appeals to people who remember it the first time around, then when parents are deciding what to take their kids to the cinema to see, they're probably gonna take the thing that they're familiar with, and suddenly that film company has doubled the size of their audience, right? And I think probably the best example of that in the games industry is Nintendo, who it's right there in their advertising. Families playing. There was an advert for Mario Kart this year with a little girl playing Mario Kart with her grandfather, and her grandfather saying, "Your mum used to play this when she was a kid." So you can have these generational connections that, yeah, you could take a cynical view of, that's a company exploiting emotions, but it's quite a positive thing, actually, I think, for people to have those connections and to be able to share something from their childhood with another generation.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very strong. Okay, so I mean, we have, as we know, a mix of consumers, aspiring developers, students, and so on in the audience. So if we were to conclude maybe with one sort of piece of advice, or perhaps a pitfall to avoid, to anyone who's thinking of making a nostalgic game, what would that be?
Well, I don't know. It's a difficult one, because I think the games I'm working on at the moment are a product of our circumstance. I'm going back to doing game development for the first time in 20 years, rather than managing teams to do games who will bring forward their ideas at that point in their time, right? But now I'm back making games. It isn't a deliberate play to make a nostalgic game. It's just kind of how I'm wired up. That's just what I design or think like. The only thing I think we did deliberately was try and create a style that we thought wouldn't age quickly, because tech does move on and trends move on. But to go in using nostalgia as a unique selling point is kind of risky if it's not something that you can't help but do. So yeah, by all means, if that's what excites you, that nostalgia play is what you want to, your starting point, that's your bag, great, but just be mindful things will move on. As Ashley said earlier, what's nostalgia today might not be nostalgia tomorrow, and I think you've just got to be kind of find your own groove, really, and do something that speaks to you, whatever that may be. If you're a 2D artist, don't try and be a 3D artist if actually that's where your passion is. Do the 2D thing, 'cause that's absolutely valid. If you're a 3D person, and even if you kind of like nostalgic games, but you're more into the tech side, well, just play to your strengths. Don't try and play to the audience, because that audience might not be there tomorrow.
Cool. If no further thoughts, we can open the floor to questions in just a second, but I'd like to, I mean, since we're all nostalgic here, as we said, and we've got so many, and we've got a couple of good developers great developers of nostalgia titles, I just want to give you guys an opportunity to sort of question each other if there's anything you'd like to ask. I think Ashley, maybe you had something.
Yeah, I think we've touched a little bit on the topic I wanted to ask these two gentlemen about. But I often get the sense from working with game developers that they are more comfortable working in completely new ideas, because it gives them a blank canvas in which to really let their ideas run wild. But am I correct? Do you love working on completely new ideas, or is there some fun as a developer to be found in sequels and revivals?
Go, Charles.
I'm going to talk about the wonderful constraints that I think it's absolutely terrifying. And we have had publishers come to us in the past and say, do whatever you want. And that's great, because, well, it's great in some ways until you then go back to them and they go, well, that isn't quite what we wanted. The thing about constraints is that, technical constraints, is that it also allows you, it bounds what you can do, and it allows you to excel and stay focused. So I would actually say no. I think it's great to have constraints, whether those constraints be technical, whether those be constraints because you're working on an IP that's either yours or somebody else's. I actually think constraints are great. Although, of course, if you're talking about nostalgia and you're going back to the 80s or the 90s, those constraints weren't seen as constraints at the time, of course, because they were what you had. So we've got to be a little bit careful on the terminology. But no, I love having constraints, because it means that you can really focus on what you want to achieve. A blank piece of paper is terrifying.
I mean, I can talk to many failures over the last 15 years. Fable was such a successful Lionhead, and mine wasn't the Fable team, that when I was trying to compete with Fable, I'd get games to sort of, if you like, production phase, and then there'd be that kind of, do we need this in the portfolio? And then it gets knocked back again and knocked back again. And that's just the way it is for a lot of studios, to be honest. So it's great to have a situation where you've afforded yourself that chance to continue making things without too many people objecting. So there's good on both sides. I loved coming up with some of the ideas we did back in the day with Lionhead that didn't get off the ground. I'm proud of them, but they never got to be played. So I think there's both sides of the coin, really. I liked new ideas. I like working with teams on something fresh and different, but I hate them being canned. So I think if you've got the opportunity to make something else in the same, kind of ilk, then you're in a privileged position and you shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth sometimes. But make sure it's fresh. Don't just exploit it, develop it and move it on.
Is there, are there any of those ideas that you are able to talk about that you particularly miss or allude to?
That made and got canned in the past?
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't, but I can see people squirming over there. But no, I mean, the wonderful thing of having such a long period of time working with Peter Molyneux is he has a million really out there concepts that shouldn't get off the ground anyway. But he's afforded the opportunity, and I often got the job of running those teams and developing those projects. But that's still a wonderful opportunity to try and come up with something that no one's done before, because that's always the the goal, that you come up with this magic game. I probably shouldn't mention some of them because I probably am under some weird NDA.
That's that. I don't want to get you in trouble, of course.
Certainly not with our PR team.
Okay, great. Let's get some questions from the audience, please. Can we get some hands up? Yes, sir, you, sir. If you'd like to stand up and just sort of speak into the mic. That's conveniently right next to you. I'll check our Twitch as well, just to see if we had any questions there. I'm disconnected.
Hello. Do you want to sing a little song while you're there?
How's everybody doing? Thanks for the talk. My question was, I wrote it down. So, like, as the sort of the newer generation of game developers comes. Hello, can you hear me better?
Yeah, it's better, thank you.
Awesome. As new developers are coming onto the game development scene and tools are becoming more accessible for game development, what I've kind of noticed is there's a sort of a real emergence of people trying to recreate experiences that may not exist anymore. So stuff like World of Warcraft Classic, maybe like updating stuff with like Half-Life. There was a team that recreated the Black Mesa thing. And the kind of response from game developers is there's some very different attitudes of like, do we suppress other people from trying to recreate these experiences, or do we support them and give them free rein to do what they want? And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
It feels like fan fiction, and I think that's a great thing, right? If people want to take on something that has been put down for whatever reason, usually a business reason why that's not being developed, then I think, salvage it as a community and make something with it. And that's like, to me, it's the equivalent of fan fiction. So I'm all for that. And actually, it's probably a good indication, if people are excited by things like that these things shouldn't be. Sometimes it is good to rest IP, by the way. You shouldn't just make things because there's a business there. But to me, it's quite exciting when things get salvaged and reinvented by a community of new developers or even fans. So that's my take on that.
I think when you see these things happening, often they're happening out of necessity because the fans who are taking on this work are doing so because there is a need that needs fulfilling. And in many cases, that need is that people want to play old games. And if they're not commercially available, then they have to come up with some other solution. Or if they're not compatible with modern hardware, or they weren't translated into English. And that's something I think publishers are increasingly taking notice of. And personally, I think there should be a greater effort to preserve classic games and make them available to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Charles, any thoughts? Or
well, only the question, of course, I mean, again, back to what was talked about earlier, is the ownership of IP, and there are different IP owners are very different in their approach. as we experience. And I'd agree with the general consensus here that if you're not exploiting your IP, then allow people within limits, of course, but allow people a degree of flexibility and to create fan fiction. And as long as it is fan fiction, and as long as it's clear the difference between what's official and what's created by fans, I think it works well for the IP, and I think it works well for the fans.
Yeah.
Be generous.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. Thank you, sir. Any more for any more? Yes, gentlemen. Thank you.
So I think the key thing about nostalgia is engaging people's imagination. So it's kind of enabling them to sort of see and think differently without it all being given to them. A lot of modern games and films deliver everything straight to people. So it's more about skill and speed of things. So I think there's a huge need for customers to have their imaginations engaged, and that's crucially what some of this nostalgia perhaps taps into. What do you think?
I thought exactly that on the train, and that was annoying myself. It's really annoying because I was going to say exactly that point. So you've kind of, well, you haven't stolen my thunder. I forgot my thunder, but it's a great point. I think it's great to use your imagination in anything. A book, not having everything laid out so cleanly and allow you to sort of interpret what's been put in there. So the constraint we had allowed people to use their own imagination to fulfill, whatever they wanted. So it's not limited by the game. So I think it's a wonderful point, and that is a cool thing about simpler times, I guess, and simpler games, that I think people did kind of role play it in their mind a little bit more than having something literally laid out and with heavily script written and motion captured and performed by great actors. It's wonderful, but I guess a game is something that you play the part of more than if you watch a film. I don't imagine I'm James Bond when I watch a James Bond movie. Daniel Craig does that part for me, but when you play a game, you kind of fall into that role. So it's really nice not to fill in all the blanks. So I think it's a really good point.
I wonder if the sort of growth of the internet and of media and of communities around games is a part of that as well. Because when you're playing something like Final Fantasy VII or something like a big, complicated, obscure RPG before all of the answers and all the secrets were spilled out for you on the internet, there was a lot more of that same sensation. So part of the environment, I guess, as well as the development of games and making them more sophisticated has something to answer to there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just add, could we have some more Broken Sword games?
Yes, please.
Bless you. Thank you.
Well, actually, I mean, still taking questions from the audience. Yes, lady at the back there, thank you. But I have a final thought for Charles, perhaps.
Hi. One of my very, very favorite genres in media and in games is cyberpunk. And as we all know, it comes from an era in the 80s when people were really afraid of the Japanese tech wave and that there was that kind of fear there. And we see a lot of nostalgic media that kind of takes all that wholesale and kind of repeats it without really engaging in the problematic aspects and the racism. Do you think that cyberpunk would still be the same without that sort of exotification? Is it possible to deconstruct that nostalgia and still enjoy it now that we're older and wiser?
That is a hell of an essay question.
Yes.
I must say. I'm not sure I'm smart enough.
You're the writer.
A young man like Ashley, of course, won't remember, but Gary and I will remember the Cold War, and which was really, and I think that a lot of it was born out of. I think Cyberpunk was really born out of that era where everybody was really terrified of nuclear war, and obviously by the end of the 80s, when the Berlin Wall fell down, we knew that there was going to be world peace. We knew that there would never be any. We'd be friends with Russia, and that none of this would ever happen again. And Do we not think that actually part of the revival of Cyberpunk is this terrifying cycle where, despite our desires, despite our best intentions, we're kind of just going around in a circle again? And I mean, maybe it was all inevitable. Sorry to be so negative.
Cool. Well, I had one more thought for Charles. We touched on it in the 2 Point panel earlier today, why the 2 Point Studios guys felt the need to sort of, or decided the time was right to revisit Theme Hospital, or sort of, make another hospital sim. Why, you recently sort of revisited one of your own hits with Beyond a Steel Sky rather than Beneath. What made you feel that the time was right to do that?
Well, part of it, to be honest with you, is the incredible passion and loyalty that we have from, and I can't see the audience, but from the last person who asked about a new Broken Sword. I mean, what a huge privilege! What a huge privilege to have people that care enough to ask questions like that. And so really, they make the decision very easy because there is this audience. And as I was trying rather unarticulately to say before, when we do write a sequel, we bring forward the world, we bring forward the characters, we bring forward the knowledge, we bring forward the empathy, and it's kind of easier to set up than writing a new game. And hopefully it's more satisfying to an audience that, in the case of Broken Sword, has been playing the same fairly infrequently, but over 25 years.
Lovely. Well, I think we'll wrap it there. But thank you guys so much for coming down and viewing the talk and asking all these lovely questions. You can see how much it means to the developers. And thank you guys for coming and sharing your time. Let's have a round of applause, please, for the panel. Do stick around right here in the PCGamesN Theatre. We've got another Trends in Game Dev panel coming up on relaxation and relaxing games coming up next. But yeah, thanks very much, and have a great day at W.A.S.D.